Can I have Deputy Chief Denise Schmidt, please, come to the podium? So this is a large group. So the first names that I call, I'd like you to come up and stand on the first stair, on the top stair, please. Officer Elaine Baca, Officer John Glenn, Officer Michael Keene, Officer Stephen Kerwin, Officer Jeffrey Brown, Officer John Rockland, Sanjay Shastri, Officer Robert Toomey, Officer Angel Poon, Officer Tuava Johnson. Deputy Chief Smith is going to read the entire scenario. These officers will get their awards first, and then the next round of officers that I call, if you could stand, please, down on the lower level. Sergeant Aaron Para, Sergeant Dennis O'Mahony, Officer James Cunningham, Officer Derek Lee, Officer Stuart Mulver, Officer Antoinette Valenzuela, Officer Donald McIntyre, and believe me, I've been practicing this one, Lieutenant Gatiano Caltaguglione.
That's a little rough. There it is. On Saturday, July 6th, 2013, at approximately 11:25 hours, Asiana Flight 214 was on final approach and preparing to land at San Francisco International Airport. The aircraft was a Boeing 777 with 307 people on board. It was a calm, sunny Saturday morning of a holiday weekend, and there was no indication that there would be any problem with this landing. Suddenly, and without warning, the aircraft crashed into the seawall at the end of runway 28 left. The impact severed the tail of the plane completely. The plane banked upward and then downward, made a complete 360-degree spin, and then slammed into the ground, breaking into pieces and catching on fire. Officer Jeff Brown was on patrol on the airfield and witnessed that crash. He called a code 33 and notified dispatch that a 777 had just crashed on runway 28 left. Officer James Cunningham was also patrolling the airfield at the north end near the private Signature Air Services. Officer Cunningham witnessed the crash and immediately began driving towards the downed, smoking plane. Realizing the high number of people who would be injured and in need of critical care, Officer Cunningham spotted a private ambulance on the airfield and commandeered the crew to respond with him to the crash site. The San Francisco police officers on duty at the airport that morning raced to the crash site from throughout the airport. They were the first emergency personnel to arrive at the burning, heavily damaged 777. Platoon Commander Lieutenant Gaetano Caltagirone, Sergeant Aaron Para, Sergeant Dennis O'Mahony, Officer James Cunningham, Officer Stuart Mulver, Officer Derek Lee, Officer Angel Poon, Officer Antoinette Valenzuela, Officer Elaine Baca, Officer Andrea Joseph, Officer John Glenn, Officer Michael Keene, Officer Stephen Kerwin, Officer Jeff Brown, Officer John Rockland, Officer Sanjay Shastri, Officer Robert Toomey, Officer Tuve Johnson, and Officer Donald McIntyre converged on a sight that none of them had ever expected to see. The rear of the aircraft was torn open and crushed down. The right engine was smashed against the plane's fuselage, making escape from one side of the plane impossible. The left engine was torn from the wing, allowing a 4 to 6 diameter stream of jet fuel to spew onto the ground, saturating the dry grass below their feet. The oil lines had ruptured, causing the aircraft to catch fire. Lieutenant Caltagirone, Sergeant Pera, and Sergeant O'Mahony quickly assessed the situation and knew the plane, full of passengers and crew, would not get out without help. Those victims who were able to get off the plane were wandering injured and dazed in the path of airplanes taxiing on the runways. Lieutenant Caltagirone and his sergeants knew that anything but quick, coordinated action would result in the death of several hundred people. At the same time, they recognized that the aircraft could explode if the fuel from the left side of the aircraft made contact with the fire that was now rising up the right side of the aircraft. If this happened, the explosion and fire would quickly consume the aircraft, also causing certain death to the passengers, crew, and every officer on that field. They implemented a plan to direct the victims away from the danger, establish collection points for triage, and rescue and evacuate the trapped passengers and crew. Officer Derek Lee and Officer Angel Poon, who had responded by riding in baggage carts to get near the scene and then running more than a half a mile across the airfield, immediately began corralling the passengers that had self-evacuated. Their immediate and clear directions saved countless lives as the disoriented, injured, and terrified passengers were running in all directions away from the aircraft, including across active runways, subjecting themselves to imminent death if they were struck by another aircraft. Officers Cunningham and Lee soon noticed that although the inflatable escape ramps were deployed, one had failed to deploy properly and was actually blocking an emergency exit. The flight attendants on board were yelling for help to release the ramp and cut seat belts that had locked, trapping some of the passengers in their seats. The officers and flight attendants coordinated a plan to clear the exit by puncturing the inflatable escape ramp with the officers' knives and then using the knives to cut the passengers free from their seats. Officers Cunningham and Lee threw their pocket knives to the flight attendants, who used them to puncture the ramp and clear the exit and free the passengers. At the rear of the plane, escape was even more difficult. The exit was blocked with debris, and people were screaming that they were trapped. Lieutenant Caltagirone and Officer Cunningham were dressed only in their Class B uniforms with no breathing apparatus and with no tools or rescue equipment at their disposal. Both of them entered the burning plane, where they encountered intense heat and thick black smoke that continued to fill the cabin, making it difficult to breathe and see. The inside of the cabin was in total ruin. Rows of seats were dislodged from their floor mountings and twisted in several different directions. The passengers were trapped between the twisted rows of seats. The overhead baggage compartments were torn out of their mounting and had fallen on the passengers, pinning them under the weight of the compartments and luggage. Many of the passengers were in shock and so badly injured that they were unable to evacuate themselves. Lieutenant Caltagirone and Officer Cunningham began using physical force to pull the debris away from the passengers and handed that debris off to Officers Valenzuela and Lee, who threw it away from the aircraft. They were successful in rescuing the passengers that were trapped, and they created a path for passengers to be evacuated from the aircraft. The officers gave evacuation instructions to anyone that was physically able to exit the aircraft, and then all the officers began carrying passengers out and handing them to the officers that were outside the aircraft. During this rescue effort, Lieutenant Caltagirone and Officer Cunningham entered and exited the burning aircraft more than a dozen times. The number of persons injured was so great that it would have taken an extensive amount of time to evacuate the injured in ambulances. The officers on the field immediately began immobilizing the injured and transported them in the back of air safety pickup trucks in order to get them away from the aircraft in case it exploded. When these officers ran out of backboards, they wrapped their arms around the injured passengers' bodies and physically immobilized them to prevent further injury during transport to the medical triage area. And then they returned back to the plane. The San Francisco Fire Department units assigned to the airport likewise had no warning about the crash, and they were on scene in approximately 3 minutes and 30 seconds. They immediately began fire suppression efforts, entering the plane in full turnout gear. Due to the severity of the incident, they made an immediate request for mutual aid, bringing in San Mateo and San Francisco Fire Department. After rescuing numerous passengers and crew members from inside the plane, Lieutenant Caltagirone and Officer Cunningham were alerted by members of the fire department that several passengers were unaccounted for and might still be on the aircraft. Although they were certain that they had evacuated all the passengers, they ran back into the aircraft from the rear and continued to search for victims. The aircraft was still on fire, and the intensity of the smoke and heat had grown, making it almost impossible to see. These officers continued to search the aircraft until they were relieved by members of the fire department wearing firefighting turnout gear and self-contained breathing apparatus. In the end, it was determined that the initial efforts of the SFPD members had been successful. Every passenger had been evacuated from that aircraft. 182 of them were eventually transported to local hospitals for their injuries. After the situation stabilized, it was determined that Officer Cunningham had ingested so much smoke that he had to be treated for smoke inhalation. Each of these members immediately responded to the crash site and arrived within 2 to 5 minutes of this crash. They entered a crash site and located themselves immediately outside of the burning aircraft. A severely damaged, rapidly leaking fuel and on fire, a great risk of explosion and death for all who remained outside and returned. During the investigation, 2 individuals with expertise in aviation crashes were interviewed regarding the actions of these officers and the risk that they faced. One, a licensed pilot and aviation safety expert, and the other, a nationally recognized expert on aviation crashes. Both agreed that the aircraft still had significant quantity of jet fuel in its tanks, and the quantity was more than sufficient to fuel the fire and incinerate the entire aircraft or possibly cause it to explode. They also stated that the fuel spewing from the aircraft was extremely hazardous in many ways. Not only will it ignite from contact with fire, but when it is exposed to air in a crash scenario like this, it converts into an aerosol mist, and the mist can ignite from the radiant heat. Because the crash scenes are so volatile, in fact, the Federal Aviation Administration guidelines recommend that passengers should be evacuated within 90 seconds of the crash. These officers were there within well under that 90 seconds, and they remained well beyond. The actions of the members of the San Francisco Police Department were invaluable in rescuing the passengers and getting them away from the burning aircraft. These members were directly involved in the successful rescue of 304 passengers and crew from the aircraft. Without a moment's notice, they were in the midst of a disaster scene and immediately went into action. Individual stories of heroics abound in the actions of these officers on the field that day. But this was a team that came together at the exact place and time needed to save lives. Each of these brave officers had sufficient time to assess the situation, and each of them could have stood back and directed the people exiting the plane to safety from a distance. But instead, they each made the decision to approach the aircraft that could have easily exploded into a ball of fire and remain in that deadly area so they could rescue the passengers and crew. In doing this, the officers placed their lives at great risk, but in the end, they were successful in saving the lives of 304 people. Because of their extraordinary actions, these members are awarded medals of valor and life-saving awards.
Let's let these guys. The officers that were just seated received silver medals of valor. These 8 officers will receive gold